I'll tell you when it's ready. Okay, ready.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of our training on understanding and responding to distress. This training has been created jointly with the Resilience Project and with Enfys. My name is Harriet Colley and I'm a clinical psychologist at Enfys.
Hi everyone, my name's Izzy Hayter-Rogers and I'm a graduate mental health worker, or otherwise known as a resilience worker in the Resilience Project.
Fab. So we'll start with just a little bit of an overview, just to say that this training has been specifically designed for education staff working with children and young people in Cardiff and the Vale of Glamorgan. It's broken into 2 one-hour sections, so you might want to watch these training sessions with your education staff during an inset day or a twilight session, and throughout the training there's opportunities to pause and reflect with your team about how the information and strategy discussed can be applied within your education setting. Just to say as well at this point, if you haven't already watched part 1, then we recommend that you watch part 1 before going on to this part 2 training version, so that it all joins together and makes sense. So I'll just briefly explain our teams and how they work. So both the Resilience Project and Enfys work really similarly in this tiered model that you can see there on the screen. We both offer universal support at the bottom of the pyramid. This includes things like resources and training. And we both offer then more targeted support, so consultations for staff to think about specific young people and their needs. And we also offer group work. So Resilience Project offers group work to children and young people, and Enfys offers this to adults such as foster carers and social workers. And then right at the top of the pyramid, you can see that we do some direct interventions with children, young people and their families. Where the teams differ is that Enfys is a Cardiff and Vale Health Board service for children who are looked after, and the Resilience Project is a project between the Health Board, the Mental Health Foundation and Education, and work more broadly to support schools around those children that they have concerns with but don't fit easily into the existing services already. If you want any more information about each of our teams and what we offer, then please do get in contact with us. Our email addresses are going to be at the end of this training presentation, so you can get them there. So as I mentioned, this training is a 2-part series. So the aim is to build on our knowledge and understanding of distress and how to respond to this within the school environment. So part 1 you should have already watched, and this focuses on understanding distress. And then part 2 is focusing on how we respond to this distress. So this section today that we're focusing on will look at the whole class approach versus more individualized approaches. We're also going to look at the 3 R's of responding to distress, as well as the 2 hands approach. Then we're going to think about these strategies in the context of a case study, and then we'll go on to show you some further resources if you're interested in doing any more reading around this area. So just as a quick recap of part 1, we thought about the impact of trauma and adverse childhood experiences, and what some of these things might be. And we discussed the fact that trauma is very much a psychological response rather than the event itself, and that different people will have different responses to different events and experiences. We thought about how trauma impacts brain development, and specifically the overdevelopment of the threat response. And then we thought about how we recognise distress through the window of tolerance and kind of meeting children where they're at and noticing which part of the window of tolerance they're currently in, whether they're within it or outside of it. We also thought about the difference between guilt and shame, and about how often children who've experienced developmental trauma experience high levels of shame. And then we thought a little bit about some of the triggers and challenges that we might see in education settings.
So now we're going to think in this section about how to respond to distress. So we've made sense of it, and now we're looking at what can the adults and people do in schools and education settings to respond to a child when they're in that distress. So we're going to think about this in terms of the whole class approach. And then also we're going to think about it in terms of the individual, so one-to-one approach. So the whole class approach is really useful because it's thinking about how we respond on a more universal level. So as a whole class or even as a whole school. And it can be really useful to take the focus off of that individual that might be struggling, and it can reduce the likelihood that they'll experience that shame that we talked about in part 1. And it can also help to improve the well-being of lots of children at once, which can be really useful at a time when you know that a lot of children are experiencing distress, such as we're coming out of lockdown and people are still experiencing the impact of COVID. There's going to be a lot of children who are in your class feeling distressed. So these whole class strategies can meet the needs of lots of children at once. We recommend prioritising these whole class approaches, the focus on creating felt safety, calmness, and allowing opportunities to build connections. And that's going to be between the teachers and the pupils themselves, and even between the school staff yourselves. It's really, really important that you all feel safe and connected as well. And on that note, your well-being is so, so important. You are doing such a difficult job at a really difficult time, and looking after your well-being is really vital. You deserve to feel calm, safe and connected just as much as the children and young people you're caring for. And prioritising staff well-being will allow the byproduct of improved well-being for the children and young people. So it's great all around. There's lots of different ways we can look after staff well-being. We've, as a Resilience Project, we've got resources of this that we'll show at the end. There's also these activities that we'll talk about now more briefly. So we've got the staff shout out. So this is an activity to boost morale, build connections in schools. So it's just the idea that it's more of like a thank you board. So either anonymously or not, you can sort of highlight someone that's doing a good job and put that there for people to see, make people feel proud of the work that they've done. And then naturally, there's going to be times when you might think, oh, am I doing a good job? Why am I doing this? I'm really struggling at the moment. Things feel really, really hard. It's really good to help yourself in those moments by, in advance, making notes of the times that you've thought, oh, I'm really proud of myself there. Oh, I did a good job there. So a comment from a pupil or a parent that's made you smile. Write down those moments in a little book or save them in a draft email. And then on those days where you're struggling, you can refer back to them, look back over them and remind yourself of how hard you're working and what are great things you've achieved. Another sort of way to do a whole class or whole school approach to building wellbeing is to look at introducing activity breaks into the day. So for example, think of this, the end of the day, everyone seems restless, disinterested. Right, come on everybody, let's all do 10 jumping jacks. So it's all of those activities, the sort of, like we talked about, up-regulating, building your energy, what things can you do on a whole class level. So there's some really good resources on YouTube for these. So we've got the My Life YouTube channel or Go Noodle, and the things you could show in the classroom to get everyone up and moving, or you could do some whole class wellbeing skills like these breathing exercises, which we'll show you now. So this is a video, for example, that you could show to your class.
And imagine that you can smell your rose. Now pretend your finger is a candle. Mine is green, like the trees in a forest. What color is your candle? Now breathe in and purse your lips and breathe out through your mouth with the soft whooshing sound just like we made before. Imagine that the flame of your candle blew out. Okay, now let's put both parts of the game together. When you breathe in, imagine you're smelling the rose, and when you breathe out, imagine you're blowing out the candle. Breathe in through your nose and smell the rose. Breathe out through your mouth and blow out the candle. Breathe in and smell the rose, and blow out the candle.
So these are just fun sort of activities that everyone can do, and through them you're teaching them skills that those children can use at times when they become distressed in the future. Another sort of whole school or whole class approach is to do these emotional check-ins. So you can do them in the morning or at the end of the day, and they're just different ways to check in about how they're feeling. And they're a good way to do it without the sort of typical, how are you? I'm fine sort of, response. It can sort of go a bit more deeper into what the children and young people are experiencing, what things they're enjoying or not enjoying throughout their day. So for example, we've got the weather report. So you could put them on the board and they could write down in their book. So if your mood was a weather, what would it be? So if they're angry, they could think about it as a thunderstorm. If they're happy, they could think about it as being the sun. Or you could think about what they're feeling in terms of songs or movies. Or you think about the best part of the day, or something they're looking forward to, or what they're not really looking forward to that day. So it's just a way to get a deeper understanding of what they're feeling throughout the different points of the day. For children that might struggle to do this, instead of just forcing them or asking them to repeatedly, you can kind of model it for them. So, oh, the best part of my day was that cake that I had for lunch, or I'm really not looking forward to walking home in the rain later though. That would definitely be the thorn of my flower, for example. Or you can talk about them. So, oh, I noticed you loved playing football earlier. I think that's going to probably be the rose of your day. Or that English essay that you've got to do probably seems like it's going to be the thorn. And it'll be easier the more that you do this for them to sort of think about their check-in with themselves then as they're going throughout the day. And then we can, so just going back to the whole class, whole school approaches, we've got some resources on this that we'll share at the end as well. So now moving on to thinking about the individualized approach. So there are going to be children who will need that one-on-one individualized support. So they might be the ones that aren't really engaging with those whole class activities that we've gone over. So they might be showing extreme signs of distress, or those behaviors that you need to respond to because they're causing harm to themselves, or they like to cause harm to others. And this individualized approach that we're going to talk through in a moment, it's going to be best done discreetly or away from the rest of the class, to reduce that likelihood of them feeling that shame that we talked about in part 1, and increase the likelihood that they'll engage and be open and honest with you. So now let's have a think about how this could look. So when we're thinking about how to respond to a child that's in distress, they're showing those distress responses that we showed you in part 1. It's going to be really, really helpful to remember this model called the 3 R's. This is going to be really important. If you could take anything away from this training, please try and think of remembering the 3 R's of responding. So this is a 3-step model that was thought up by Dr. Bruce Perry. So he's the leading psychiatrist specializing in childhood developmental trauma. So it's based on the idea that we need to calm and connect with the child before we can then reason with them. They need to be in an engaged and calm state in order to process and understand what we're talking to them about. And so we'd even actually add to that to say that, you as the adult needs to be in that calm and engaged state before you can help them to be in that calm and engaged state. Understandably, there's going to be times when you're pushed out that window of tolerance that we talked about in part 1. There are going to be times when you're kind of stressed, angry, upset, and that's understandable. And we're going to look at ways to, focus on you as the adult being calm and regulated, and then the child is becoming calm and regulated, and then moving on to the steps of relating and reasoning. So that's why the very first step is to make sure that you as the adult are calm, and then the child has become calm as well. So using these strategies to return us to that yellow line that we can see in the middle, that regulated state, that window of tolerance, using those strategies is a skill called emotional regulation. So it's that ability to consciously upregulate or downregulate our emotions in order to stay in that calm, regulated state. So there's 2 sort of ways that we can get to that calm regulated state. So if someone's feeling active, frantic, agitated, fight or flight mode, they're in that really high energy state, they're angry, they're frustrated, they're anxious. In order for them to become calm and regulated, they're going to need strategies that are down regulated, so that ones that reduce the intensity of their emotions, reduce the arousal. So try and think of some activities or strategies that you'd use if you needed to calm down. So for example, we've got here, maybe they could squeeze their hands tightly together and then repeat, squeeze their hands tightly together and repeat, rip up paper, anything to release that sort of energy that they're feeling. A sorting task, so getting them to sort Lego into different groups of colours, throwing a beanbag or kicking a ball against the wall, taking those deep breaths, so referring back to those breathing exercises that they might have learned as a whole class, writing down how they feel and then scribbling out really hard. All those things to get out there, that energy, and help them to feel more soothed and relaxed. On the other hand, there's going to be children who, when they feel distressed, they're going to be in that low, shut down, numb, disconnected state. In that low energy state, they're going to need to feel, they're going to need to use strategies that are up-regulating, so that they help them to feel engaged, increase their arousal and engagement with those around them. So for example, we've got here, running cold water on their hands can be really uplifting, increase that arousal. Listening to sort of like slightly louder, more energetic music can increase their energy levels. Grounding exercises such as smelling something strong, or bouncing a ball, moving their body, doing doodles, colouring, something like that to get them engaged. Another example, they could go on a little scavenger hunt around the school, sort of looking for certain colours or objects such as leaves, anything to get them back involved in the environment, connected to the environment and the people around them. Some children might really struggle to regulate themselves by themselves, so they might not know of these strategies they can use to help them get back to that regulated state, and they might need help from an adult to co-regulate alongside them. So that's when you sort of use these activities and you do them together so that they learn what they can do to help get them back to that regulated state. And then through these repeated experiences of co-regulation, they'll begin to develop the skills for self-regulation. So they'll begin to engage in these strategies by themselves. So if we have a moment to pause and reflect here, can you try and think of some more strategies that you think could be really useful in, first of all, up-regulating young people to engage and energize themselves? What about some strategies to down-regulate, to calm and reduce their arousal? So we'll carry on now, but if you need more time, please just pause the video there and come back to us when you're ready.
Fab. So we're moving on now to the next R, which is relate. So once both you and the child are in a calm, regulated state, we can move up to the next R, which is relate. The relating stage is all about showing the child that you're there, that you're beside them, that they're safe, and that you're really trying to understand how they feel. Dan Hughes, who is a clinical psychologist, has developed an approach that's called PACE that's really useful in this stage. PACE is a way of interacting with children that aims to make them feel safe and to feel connected with you. It's based on how parents connect with their young children, and it helps to build up trust, connectivity, and openness. For these children who've not felt safe in their early relationships, we need to work extra hard to make sure they feel safe in their current relationships, and PACE is how we do this. So PACE is a way of being rather than a specific strategy. So we should be trying to use PACE in all of our interactions with young people, regardless of whether they're currently distressed, because it's always going to help them feel connected and safe, which is what we want children to be feeling all the time in an ideal world. There's 4 parts to PACE. There's playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. They don't need to be incorporated in any particular order, and you don't have to use all of them all the time. Certain aspects of PACE are going to work at different times for different people. So it's all a bit of a trial and error, I guess, and getting to know the young people and what works best for them at which times. So we'll go through them all individually in the order they are there. So the idea of playfulness is how we interact with children to keep this conversation light, calm, using that friendly tone. So what the aim of playfulness is to express that we're interested in them, we care for them, and through this way of interacting, the child is more likely to view the potential conflict or rupture in any relationship as temporary, and that it's not going to harm the strength of their relationship or mean that you care for them any less. So it's the difference between using a friendly, playful way of, oh, wow, Tom, you looked really angry earlier, versus a kind of more annoyed, less playful version of, right, Tom, you looked really angry earlier. So there's that kind of playfulness and using that sing-song tone of voice to help children know that they're feeling safe. And if we're playful with people, it's really hard for them to be defensive. So by using playfulness, we keep everybody in the interaction feeling open and engaged. Importantly, which I know is really hard in a British society, is that we don't use sarcasm. These young people don't understand that sarcasm is a way of joking and often might take it really seriously and personally. So I know that's really tricky because we all use sarcasm lots in our day-to-day life, but it's about trying to just keep the tone of voice playful. And sometimes it's about literally playing as well, but in more kind of day-to-day life, it's about using that kind of sing-song, storytelling, lightness to your interactions. And then we go on to think about acceptance. And so this isn't necessarily about accepting the behaviour, but it's accepting the experience, their emotional world and their inner world about what's going on. So it's saying that their experience isn't right or wrong, it just is what it is, and we accept that. So we want to help the children to make sense of what's going on for them. So for example, if a child has said, everybody in school hates me, someone replying saying, of course they don't be silly, you've got loads of friends, is likely to make a child feel dismissed. Instead, in an acceptance way, we might say, wow, that must be really hard coming to school if you feel like that. We accept their inner experience and it helps them to feel a lot more seen and heard. Then if we move on to curiosity, this is all about wondering about what these children's behaviours mean, why they're behaving in that way, what sense they're making of it, and if they're responding in which way. It's not about asking specific, why did you do that questions and expecting a reply. This curiosity is kind of wondering out loud without expecting the child to respond. Because they might not even be aware of why they responded in the way that they did. It's about kind of making guesses for them and being interested in their internal world and being curious about why they did what they did without expecting them to answer it. Often these children will say, that's not what happened, and that's great, we love that. It's nice to have them respond and tell us how they have been feeling, but importantly, we're not expecting that. So it might be saying something like, oh, I'm wondering if it's because you've had a really tough day at school today, haven't you? And you know, John was really mean to you and he said that horrible thing to you. So I wonder if that's why you're now feeling really upset. And we don't need the young person to say yes or no. It's just for them to know that we are making guesses and we're trying to really understand what's going on in their internal world. Finally, we have empathy. And when we're showing empathy, we show the child that we see their distress, we feel it, and we get it. We understand why it's really tough. So the idea is that we're offering kind of comfort and we're communicating with them that we are there and we support them. So we're connecting with that feeling and we're expressing it. God, that sounds really, really difficult. I'm not surprised that that's the way that you feel. So that is a kind of summary of PACE. It's a very whistle-stop tour, and it's something that we encourage you to practice a lot. So it might be that you practice it in adult relationships. You can have a go at practicing it with one another, trying to pace each other throughout the day. Before you kind of practice it with the young people, and keep going with it. For some young people, this is going to feel really strange and really unusual that there's an adult there that's trying to understand how they feel and trying to make sense of their internal world. So you might get some weird responses, and we like that. We like it if kids say, "You're being really strange. I don't know what's going on here." We like that. Different is good. So it's just about giving it a go and having a practice with PACE until it feels comfortable, because it doesn't necessarily feel comfortable first of all. So yeah, keep going at it. So once we have done the relate part of the 3 R's, we can move up to this third R, which is the reason. So after they're regulated and we've connected with them, we understand their experience, then we can start putting in some of this reasoning. If, for example, they engage in a behaviour that wasn't appropriate and a boundary needs to be put in place, we can talk to them about their behaviour and understand why it wasn't appropriate. But that can only come after we've connected with the child. So in section 1, we spoke about how these children have experienced high levels of shame and still do, and that when we discipline them, they see this as a reflection on themselves rather than a reflection on their behaviour. So they think that they're a bad person rather than they did something that they shouldn't have. So in order for children to learn, we first need to let them know that they're safe and regulated and connected before we go on to think about what we do in response. And that thinking about connecting before we go on to the response is called connection before correction. So it's these 2 hands approach. So with the one hand, first of all, we provide this warmth, this nurture and this connection, and then following that we provide structure and discipline and boundaries. We recognize that these behaviors aren't okay and that they need to be changed, and that there needs to be kind of some structure and consequences as a result of that. But we need to do that connecting bit first. And importantly, what's really important with the consequences is that we want to make them as specific to the behaviour as possible. So these children have often grown up in environments that are quite chaotic and quite busy, and they therefore struggle to link cause and effect. So they might not have always been fed when they were hungry, or they might not have always been getting ready for bed when it was getting dark. So they haven't had the opportunities like the rest of us have had to learn that one thing leads to another. So we need to make the consequences really clear, that they are linked to the behaviour. That A helps them with cause and effect, and B helps them learn this is about the behaviour, this isn't about me as a person. So for example, we need to be really specific about when we talk about the behaviour. So rather than saying, "I didn't like your behaviour earlier," we could say something like, "When you threw the chair across the room, it nearly hit Tom." And then we want the consequence to be directly linked to that behaviour. So, for example, the consequence to that behaviour might be, we're going to write a letter to Tom to apologise for throwing the chair at him. It's directly linked to that behaviour, rather than you're going to have a detention for an hour after school. Because for the young person, that's really difficult for them to understand how that links to the behaviour. Okay, so this is called the 2 hands approach. And the key benefits to using the two hands approach is that it allows the adult to recognise that the children have often developed these unwanted behaviours as a way to manage and survive a threat. Although you might not think that the threat is still occurring, the child might believe that it is, or that they think it might happen again. So for them, it's safer to continue using these safety behaviours. Additionally, they might not have the ability to develop new strategies for coping by themselves. So being punished for this can cause confusion and lead to the child feeling shame, like we've just talked about. Additionally, corrective measures that only focus on changing the behaviours don't recognise that there's an underlying reason for their behaviours and that these children are distressed. So trying to stop them behaving in one way might just lead them to presenting with other unwanted behaviours because their underlying need still isn't being met. So instead, we want to connect with the child first to understand what that underlying need is, and then we can make sure that we respond in the most appropriate way. So we've introduced the idea of connection versus correction. So we're just going to pause here for you to have a little think about which of these strategies here you think would fall into the correction side and which would fall into the connection side. So we'll just give you a couple of minutes to have a go at that. So pause the recording there if you need a little bit more time, but if not, then here are the answers. So we've got in the correction side of things, so we've got timeout, rewards, consequences, and punishments. So these you can see are quite focused on the behaviour and altering the behaviour. And then connection, we've got naming their emotions for them. So that's all the kind of PACE stuff about, gosh, you look really angry right now. I wonder what's going on for you. Regulating them, going for a walk with them, preparing with them. I still think you're good. I still really like you and I like having you in my class. So reducing those levels of shame and trying to understand why they're distressed or acting in that way. So these connection bits really focus on the underlying need rather than the behaviour.
So we're going to pull all the information together that we spoke about in part 1 and just now in part 2 and apply it to this case study. So imagine now that Omar is an 11-year-old boy. At the start of the class, he's walked in slowly, sat down with his head on his desk, has his hood up over his head, he's not looking up. He's done this a number of times before, usually after lunchtime. You tried talking to him and trying to get him to be involved in the class, but he's just ignoring you. He's ignoring his peers and he just doesn't want to do the work. He keeps his head down, he barely looks up, and you ask him, how are you, what's wrong? He just shrugs and says, I'm fine. So, first of all, let's pause, reflect, be curious and wonder about what might be going on for Omar. Why is he responding the way that he is? So we might not know for sure, so it's just about making some guesses. So first of all, it's going to be helpful to sort of think about what distress response is he in? So that's back to that ladder model that we talked about before. So is he fight or flight? Is he in freeze or submit mode? And then what might his thoughts about himself, the world, and the others be? So what experiences or beliefs might have led to him responding this way? And then what might his challenges and triggers in this school environment be? So we can see he's distressed right now. What things have occurred or recently occurred that's making him feel distressed in this moment? So pause there if you need some more time to think over those questions and come back to us whenever you're ready. Otherwise, we'll move on to thinking about what our guesses might be. So like we said, we might not know for sure. It's just all about making some guesses. And what we guessed for Omar's distress response is that he seems quite like he's in that submit response when we think back to that ladder in part 1. So he looks like he's feeling quite overwhelmed, numb, shut down, isolated. And recognizing this can help to increase our empathy as we engage with Omar. We can see that, oh wow, he's really struggling right now. And it can allow us to recognize that he'd benefit from up-regulating strategies. He's in that lower box. He's in that that state where he needs those up-regulation activities that increases arousal and increases engagement. So it's a helpful way to think about, okay, what strategies might he respond better to right now? And then if we think about what Omar's internal working model might be, so we can take some guesses that adults might have let him down in the past. He might think that no one can help him anyway, so what's the point in trying? He might think, I should be able to cope with myself. I'm weak, because he might have found that he couldn't rely on adults for support before. Or adults might have left him alone and not tried to support him when he's been distressed in the past. So he might have led that to him thinking that no one cares about me anyway. And if Omar had these experiences or beliefs, it makes sense that when he's feeling distressed, he doesn't engage with adults, or he doesn't go to them for support. Because in his mind, his internal working model is telling himself that he needs to cope by himself, which might be why he's shutting off and not engaging with you when you're trying to help him. And it's important to remember that when someone is responding by being shut off or defensive or disengaged, they still have that innate need for connection and comfort, but they're suppressing it because they don't feel like it's safe to show their true needs. So instead, they're hiding their true needs in order to survive. And then we can think about Omar's challenges and triggers. So we can see that he's had his hood up and he's covering his ears and eyes. So is this a sign that he's finding the class or lunchtime overstimulating, overwhelming, and he's trying to regulate himself by shutting himself off from the noises or sounds going on around him? What is Omar's lunchtime usually like? We can think to ourselves, is he feeling isolated and alone in this class? He's just come back from his friends. Did something happen at lunchtime that's making him feel distressed? So taking the time to sort of think about Omar's distress, making sense of his distress response before you talk with him is going to be key to connecting with Omar. And then we think about how we can respond to Omar's distress. So how this would look in a sort of sequence is that you'd notice Omar in your class, you can see him with head on his desk, and we'd recommend just taking a pause, first of all, to pause in, consider whether Omar's response requires an immediate response from you. So is he able to keep himself safe? Is he harming anyone else? From Omar's distress response, we can see that it doesn't look like he requires an immediate response from you. And so before you go over to him, think of the first start, regulate yourself. So are you in a calm state? Are you in a state where you're going to be able to stay compassionate with him? If you're not, make sure to focus on your own regulation strategies first. And then you can think about whether Omar needs support to become regulated. So like we said, he seems to be feeling quite low. So he'd benefit some up-regulating strategies. So you could take a more whole class approach by sort of going, right guys, I'm feeling a bit down, like, oh, I'm a bit tired now after that break. Should we play some like music together, get us back, get us a bit stretching around? We can do an interactive activity as a whole class. Or you might think to yourself that he'd benefit from more of a one-to-one approach. And whichever one you use, it's going to be based on, you know Omar best, and you can try out different things with different children to see what they will sort of respond well to. So if you're taking that one-to-one approach, you can see he's feeling quite low. So do you think maybe he'd want to step outside, take a walk around, move his body around to energize himself, run some cold water over his hands to upregulate him? If you're able to do that with him, or someone is able to do that with him, that would be great. to co-regulate, like we said before, but we understand that that's not always possible. And we accept that too. So once Omar is regulated and you're next alone with him, you can move on to the second R, relate. So you'll wonder aloud about what might be going on with him. So he might not tell you what's happening. So it might require that you almost talk to yourself out loud and wonder, so sort of, see you had your head down covering your eyes. I'm just wondering, are you finding the classroom overwhelming, or maybe you don't really like being with people in this class, or maybe you're quite tired. I know you just come back from lunchtime, that big, there's a lot going on there. And if he does reply, focus on sort of accepting his experience rather than challenging it. So rather than sort of reasoning with him about, I know it's only lunchtime, but it's only, it's not only still the start of the day. Instead of sort of doing that response, or go, oh, wow, that must be exhausting. So we do something sort of called naming it to taming it, to sort of relaying back his emotion back to him in order to contain it. So once you've sort of talked about that with him, or whilst he's with you, you sort of have a bit of a better idea of what he might be feeling. You can move on to the third R, so that's reason. So that might be where you could problem solve the issue together to sort of work out what he might need. So could he benefit from doing his work in the library, or going to a quiet room for lunch? And that would be the part where there might need to be a consequence. So like Harriet said, a natural or logical consequence might be put in place if he'd done something that needed, so for example, if he had thrown a chair to someone and hurt someone, like Harriet said, maybe that consequence at that point would be to write an apology note. And then we've said that is the next R that isn't in that model, but we think is really, really important, is the repair stage. So this doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It could just be something as simple as saying, oh, thanks for talking with me, Omar, or oh, I love having you in my class, or a little token to show that you're still thinking about him when he's come back from class after the weekend, for example. And that's, like Harriet spoke about in part 1 of this webinar, is about repairing that relationship to move that shame into guilt. So if he'd done a behavior that had hurt someone else, it focuses on the idea that I still like you as a person, I still want you in my class, we just don't have that behavior in my class. And now we're going to watch the rest of the video about the window of tolerance that we played in part 1.
Fab. So that concludes the end of this training. Just some key messages here that we hope you can take away and keep in mind as you interact with children and young people in your schools. And these are that their current presentations of distress and the behaviours that you see at school might have underlying reasons relating to traumatic experiences. So these children might not always have full control over how they respond to their distress, and they might need support with unlearning old strategies and coming up with healthier, adaptive ones. And it's our job as the adults around them to help them with this. Secondly, the way that they view the world might be different to how you or other people in the class might view the world. If they've had negative experiences, their internal working model is likely to be negative, making it more likely that they experience shame and distrust, especially with adults. And finally, when you interact with a child in distress, try and keep in mind the model of regulate, relate, and reason to prioritise calming and connecting with the child before we put into place these corrective strategies.
So here's the resources that we'll go through in a moment. The Resilience Project has a YouTube channel. So if you type in Cardiff and Vale Resilience Project, we've got different videos on there for school staff and for parents. And a lot of them are related to coronavirus as well. So you might find that they are useful in these coming months. We've also got a Padlet page. So we put all our resources that we make onto this page called a Padlet. So if you type in that link that you see there into Google, it'll come up with this page, and we've got them for all our resources for education staff. We've also got ones that you can give directly to children and young people, and we've got ones for parents and carers as well. And they're available in Welsh and in English.
We just wanted to point you towards these resources by Sarah Naish. She has written these amazing books. Sarah Naish is the head of the National Association of Therapeutic Parenting. She also is an adoptive parent herself. And she has written some lovely books which are child-friendly to think about some of these behaviours and difficulties that we might see with young people. So these are really lovely for adults and for children to have a read through. And then we've also got some other books here that are really good for having a read if you're interested in this and want to learn a bit more about attachment, about developmental trauma, and about how this all impacts the current behaviours that we see in young people and children. And specifically, Louise Bomber has written some books that are specifically about how we help these young people in school. So we recommend giving them a read. They're all absolutely great. So thank you very much for listening to our training. We hope that you found it really helpful. If you have any further questions about anything, then please feel free to get in contact with one of us. The Resilience Project's email is there, as is the Enfys email. We also have a website as well that explains a little bit more about what our service offers. So if you have any questions or queries, please get in contact with us. We're always happy to hear from you. When the webinar closes, there will be an evaluation form, so we really appreciate if you could give us some feedback on the training and what you found helpful or not so helpful.
Yeah, brilliant. That'll be in the comments on the YouTube channel.
Oh, fab. Perfect.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much, guys. Bye.